Welcome back, everyone, to Podcana episode 32. This week, we're going to be talking about updates in the metagame. We have 2 tournament results to go off of, and we're going to be focusing on Ruby Amethyst, but not in the way that you're used to. We're going to be focusing on how to beat it. I know Moyen is a bit pessimistic, but our goal basically over the next 1 to 2 weeks is to workshop as a group, as a team, the Podcana team, to come up with a deck list that beats Ruby Amethyst. Hopefully one that also has a decent matchup spread. That might be a tall order, but right now the metagame is definitely starting to stagnate a bit. Ruby Amethyst is really cementing itself as the top deck. We've seen some evolutions in the deck list, which Moyen will talk about, but it is just overwhelmingly the best deck right now. It shows up in the majority of top 8s, and I remember seeing a YouTube video, I don't know who was doing it, but they actually were aggregating the tournaments, and the top 8 representation of Ruby Amethyst is absolutely disgusting right now. So we're going to be looking for a counter deck, and we're going to be doing some brewing over the next couple weeks. Anyway, before we get there, let's talk about the headlines. Obviously, recently, outside of Lorcana, we had the holidays, so Christmas or whatever you celebrate, and of course, the New Year's coming up. I just want to get an update for you guys on how your holidays went.
Yeah, it was good. I took some time off. I was working like nonstop up until the Christmas period, up until Christmas Day, so had a nice relaxing day yesterday. Besides that, haven't really been doing much in Lorcana, like you said. Yeah, again, if you ask me what deck would I bring to the tournament, it'd probably be Ruby Amethyst at the moment. So I'm quite excited. I want to really try and work to see how we can take down Ruby Amethyst, or at least attempt to tackle the deck. What about you, Moyen? How was your holiday?
Was pretty good, but so I'm spending some time with family, but I still found a lot of time to put into all the different card games that I like to play. So
nice.
I'm having a great time.
Awesome.
Yeah. So obviously New Year's, so we're looking forward towards 2024. The biggest thing on my sort of list for 2024 is, of course, organized play for Lorcana. I hope that it's good. I really do. It's coming in Q2. I think the game has the ingredients necessary to be massively successful, and if we get a good OP circuit, that would definitely kick things off. What do you guys? We've been doing this podcast for a bit now. We're on episode 32, so we're actually getting close to the 1 year episode. I know you guys haven't been on for the entire time, but now doing the podcast, engaging with the game. What are your hopes for 2024 in regards to Lorcana?
I want one of us to win a major Lorcana event, and I want to talk about a deck list. I want it to be a deck list because I know Brendan loves doing this. I want it to be a deck list that's just like no one saw it coming. That's a tall order, but I want to see it happen, and I'm confident that at least one of us can make it for sure.
Yeah, I think we know who we would nominate to be our champion,
to
be our player.
I know who we would nominate for sure.
Yep. So for me, I like the game right now. And that is good enough for me for now. But I really, to stay in a game long term, I really need the game to have like competitive circuit. And if that comes, I'm very hopeful for the game's future and my or our involvement as a podcast in it.
Yeah, for sure. So, we're holding our breaths. Hopefully they start teasing us soon because they committed to that Q2. Hopefully we start getting some teasers.
They said January. Yeah, they said in their last post, they said they'll give us more info in January. So I'm excited. Yeah,
that's
soon.
Huge.
Soon TM.
All right, soon TM. All right, let's take a look at these tournaments. We have 2 to go off. One is a PPG 2K, which only had 37 players. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it was a 2K, so we'll go. We'll assume it was relatively competitive. And then we have a tournament in Italy that had 163 players. We have top 32 deck lists from that. Let's start with the 2K, the 37-player tournament, because it was actually won by Amethyst Steel, which is very interesting. We were talking about this deck list before we hopped on the podcast. It's a color combination we've been interested in, mostly because of its resilience to aggro while keeping the Amethyst package. That being said, this player winning this tournament absolutely had to beat and go through some Ruby Amethyst decks. What do you think about this list, and how do you think it favors into Ruby Amethyst? I know, Moyen, you were talking about you think this is probably a bit of an underdog.
Yeah, so I think the big upside of this is, as you said, that it doesn't have the same aggro weakness. It actually is really good against aggro, but I'm extremely impressed that I think in top 8 there's 4 Ruby Amethyst, and somehow they still came out on top. And that is very impressive because I see the deck having a very hard time beating Ruby Amethyst.
Mhm. And I just want to remind everybody as well, for anybody listening or watching on YouTube, if you're wondering where the deck lists are, there'll be links in the description below. This is specifically the PPG Holiday Matsuri deck list, so there'll be a link to that for there. So yeah, so when you're looking at Amethyst Steel, right? You have the Amethyst Foundation, but you add the color Steel. What are you losing when you pick that secondary color? Well, you need to ask yourself if cards like Beast, which is kind of like your key, I guess, card against a deck like Ruby Amethyst, because a lot of these other cards that you're bringing in Steel, like the Tinkerbell, like the Smash, like Let the Storm Rage On, Grab Your Swords, those are very much for aggro, right? They're not as good against Ruby Amethyst. So what are you losing when you get rid of that Ruby color pair? Well, you're getting rid of 4 3-drop Minnie Mouse, which like I said, we're going to talk about the evolution of the Ruby Amethyst deck list. And now every single Ruby Amethyst deck list is playing 4 Minnie Mouse. You're getting rid of Minnie Mouse. You're getting rid of Maui, Lady Tremaine. Be Prepared, Maleficent. Is Beast enough to do that? My argument would be no, right? It doesn't.
Okay, so just to jump in there a little bit,
Mhm.
like losing because some parts that you're losing aren't that important. Losing the Minnie Mouse sounds like a big hit at first, but because you're playing Smash, like in that matchup, your opposing Minnie Mouse might also not be that big of an issue, so you're still okay there. Then I think losing the Maui Maui is also not a great card in these matchups because it doesn't quest at all.
Mm-hmm.
But then Lady Tremaine and Be Prepared, I would say, are the big ones that you're losing. And in return, you're getting Beast, which is a pretty good card in all these mid-rangey games. And also you're getting Benja,
Mm-hmm.
so you could argue, okay, occasionally you can remove opposing spellbooks and develop your own, but the list also chose not to run spellbook. So I don't think the list really tried to be good into Ruby Amethyst either. It's not built to do that, and they still found a way to win those games.
Do you think that you could have a version of this deck list that you could tech to be more like better into something like Ruby Amethyst, better into control, while still keeping the equity for the aggro matchup? Because I would argue you also don't need that many pieces against the aggro, right? Like just a few pieces of removal should be enough to stabilize board. And once you are ahead or you do stabilize board in the later part of the game, it should be a relatively healthy place as a control deck. So are there pieces that we could add into the Amethyst Steel deck that would help against our Ruby Amethyst matchup that are not currently in the list that we're looking at?
I would say they exist for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is, I don't think enough pieces exist so that you could actually make it a good matchup or anything. But you could help that matchup in a few different ways. So I think, but some of them are not actually in the Steel side. I think to make that matchup good, you would need to play a few spellbooks yourself. Let's say around 2 spellbooks on your side. Then have 2+ Benjas to remove opposing spellbooks. So that's like one way you can try to get a little bit of an edge in that matchup. I would say the other way is you would also need Ursulas, I think, to go head to head against Ruby Amethyst.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think those are the big changes you could make if you want to be better against Ruby Amethyst playing.
If we're playing
Amethyst,
Ursula in this type of deck though against Ruby Amethyst, like doesn't it just get absolutely destroyed by a card like Tremaine and stuff like that?
No, because it draws the card. That's why Ursula is so good in the control mirror, is because it comes down, replaces itself, and it demands instant removal because it's a 3-quester.
Yeah, and knowing Lady Tremaine is one of the big efficient outs for your opponent, it is possible with this list for sure to like keep a Captain Hook on the side and just not rest it for a turn or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the Ursula is an interesting card, and we can use that to transition into what the evolution of the Ruby Amethyst deck looks like. Moyen, if you want to talk about it, it looks like we've come back around to playing efficient, evasive cards and playing some of the top end control cards that I know you and I were very fond of in Chapter 1, such as Ursula.
Yeah, so basically it's looking like it is a complete, like kind of a different deck now than it used to be in set 1, but still the version that is evolving that's like standing out on top is kind of the same twist that we put on the deck in the first set. So the cheapest evasive in format is also being run like 4 times and in every Ruby Amethyst deck, basically. And it's performing very, very well, which is the 3-cost Minnie Mouse now. It's no longer the Pongo. Pongo is competing in a different slot where you already have a lot of strong plays, and it's has one less turn to quest. So a lot of people are playing for evasive Minimouse, and people are also turning away from Elsa top end a little bit and more towards the Ursula top end, which is always doing something immediately when it's played, which Elsa to some extent also is doing, but it's already replacing itself, putting your opponent a little bit further away from 20, which is very important in the mirror, because even when they don't have board, they could reach that 20 if you don't slow them down a little bit. And also against smaller or boards where you don't need to be prepared yet, it gives you that option of playing Ursula, and then no matter what your opponent does, you can sing Be Prepared next turn, develop behind it, maybe second Ursula. So I'm again on board with jamming for Minimouse for Ursula in my deck again.
Mm-hmm.
Some other developments the archetype is going through is I think in the recent weeks people try to counter the 3-cost Alpha by playing more 2-cost Pinocchios. The one that rests one of your opposing characters and then just trading into the other. And then now we have this dynamic of people want to be playing Ursula as top end, which is also an uninkable. They're a little bit lower on Arthur. So a lot of people have cut down on the Arthurs a little bit, and now people are also cutting down on the Pinocchios, because Pinocchio is missing its prime target.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's interesting. It looks like we've gone back more towards like the hyper control deck list, but not hyper control. It's control with these effective or efficient threats in the form of Minnie Mouse, and of course now you have the Merlins as well. So it actually nowadays it just looks like an upgraded version of these Chapter 1 deck. Like
I'd say that, to be honest, like the Sapphire Ruby deck is nearly closer to what the old Ruby Amethyst was like in terms of how slow it was, but also how effective it was of like actually removing stuff. Whereas the new Ruby Amethyst also has that element of like in the matchup where it's Ruby Amethyst versus Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst now, it's not like, oh, these are both slow decks, the game's going to go on long. No, Ruby Amethyst can get low, it can actually put out targets, it can get lower pretty fast because of cards like the Merlin the Goat, because of how powerful these Madam Imp bodies are, because you're playing Merlin the Rabbit to consistently draw cards and stuff like that. Like that matchup is still super favored, in my opinion, into Ruby Amethyst. Maybe it's a little bit closer than you may think, but in general, you just have better early game cards that are coming out, whereas your opponent is just spending their entire time ramping, right? So
let's talk about some statistics here, and this is a small sample size. We're going to pull from the 2 that come this week. So the 2 tournaments, we have PPG, the Holiday 2K tournament, 37 players, and then we have 163 in the Italian, the Goat Capri Princess deck list. Okay, so out of the top 32 and top 8, so that is 40 decks. How many Ruby Sapphire decks do you think there are?
Oh, there's probably like one.
There's one. Yeah. That deck was just the absolute talk of the town in week 1, week 2 of this format, and it seems to have been absolutely deleted from the format. Moyen, do you want to talk to us a little bit about why that has happened? Do you think that it is potentially now underrated and it can come back into the format? Why has it had such a hard time as the meta has developed?
I think Kawa touched on it a little bit. It's like, I think Ruby Amethyst, I think a lot of people would agree with me, is best deck in format now until anything changes. And it's just Ruby Amethyst completely shits on the blue-red deck. So there's no place in the meta for it anymore. And it's not even like it had like that great matchups into everything else, so that would still have a place. Like it still had this weakness against aggro. So combining that together, it's just it's not a bad deck, but it's just so poorly positioned.
Yeah, it was like the deck that was like when everyone was basically how I saw it was, okay, it was week 1 of the new set. Everyone, of course, is going to keep playing Wheel Steel because most of their cards are already there. They throw in their new Cinderella, all their fancy new pieces. This deck comes out of nowhere and just shits on Amber Steel because it it's actually not even funny. That matchup, it is so favored for red blue. But then, like you said, right, it loses to aggro, and then it also loses to Ruby Amethyst now. So it's like, what happens? Whereas I felt like with Amber Steel, like you can still sometimes get there against Ruby Amethyst, but like over the past few weeks, I think I played my major tournament, like it was at the start of December, and it was probably split. I think maybe there was 5 Amber Steel, 3 Ruby Amethysts, or maybe it was closer to 50-50. I mean, as Brendan's after pointing out, I think there's way more Ruby Amethyst running around than Amber Steel, because I think people have played that matchup over the course of the past month and realized, well, one deck is just coming out on top more often than the other, you know?
So we do have a discrepancy on the podcast, and that is that I felt like in set 1, Wheel Steel was favored into Ruby Amethyst. I felt like that ultimately, I flip-flopped on the idea on like who was favored, who wasn't, throughout the metagame as it evolved. And I think I was smoking a little copium for a while on the Ruby Amethyst being favored. And at the end, I did test it quite a bit against not just Pixelborn, but against other, what I believe to be really good players. I felt like ultimately Amber Steel was favored. In set 2, how do you think that matchup goes? How close is it now?
I've done it, and it's man, it's so close. Like, okay, there's not even that many uninkables in these Ruby Amethyst lists compared to the old Ruby Amethyst list. So you need them to have a bad hand, you need them to not get the be prepared. As the Amber Steel player, you need to have the God Start, you need to have like the Queen, shift into the bigger Queen, get loads of cheap Cinderellas so you can do Let the Storm Rage on and just turn all your cards and just remove their board and hope that they don't have to be prepared. So there's a lot of conditions that have to be met. Like the way I won against Ruby Amethyst, which I think I lost the majority of the other ones, was I milled them, which shouldn't happen. Like, it's such a low percentage that actually happens, that I feel like their start is always good, right? This is the thing with Ruby Amethyst. Their start is always good. They have like if they play a 1-drop, they do their Madam Mim stuff, they can kind of remove some of your targets. Even if you manage to clear their board, you get to around turn 6, turn 7, they do their Be Prepared, they reset, they start developing again. And then when you both have to start developing again, if you're only putting down kind of one target at a time and stuff like that, you see Tremaines coming down on the board, you see them developing super good cards, like, big cards like Maui, stuff like that. So overall, it is really, really tricky. I think that, like, I don't know. I don't want to say that Amber Steel is the closest deck that can beat Ruby Amethyst. Actually, I'm going to put it out to you guys. What deck do you think actually stands the most chance at the moment against Ruby Amethyst? You could say Ruby Amethyst. You're probably going to say Ruby Amethyst against Ruby Amethyst, right? No?
No, that's not it for me.
Okay.
I think, so my problem with it is, I think the only way to actually be good against Ruby Amethyst is if you go under them by playing hyper aggro and then winning the game before their game is even starting. So you need to be extremely aggressive, and I think any other way I don't really have much faith in. So, but the only problem with that is that if you ever face like any steel deck, no matter what the second color is, you're pretty sad playing the hyper aggro deck.
Yeah,
I agree.
Playing hyper aggro for me is like torture. I hate it because it's okay when you win the game, but when you lose, it's just like so painful. You have no cards in hand, your opponent's doing all the things. You're like, oh my god. But yeah, so do you think that the matchup got worse for Amber Steel in set 2 than set 1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What
in
cards
set 1, I think I know it's not. I don't think it's. I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint it on a specific card, because it's just the deck got so much more efficient on like all levels.
Yeah.
It's
like all the Merlins, all the Madam Mims. Like it's really that package. Like that. Honestly, that package is fucking OP. Like it just is. Like that. Like Madam Mims are OP, and the Merlins they're insane.
And you also got good top enders. You still have good top end with this deck. It's not like you sacrificed your top end to have good early game. No, you just have everything. Yeah,
I would say you have the best. You have the best top end in the game.
Yeah.
Also, your 7-drops are like extremely impactful once you get to them. So of course be prepared is very important, but you had that before. And I think Ursula's decent, but I think Scar is also very important.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people aren't even playing any Scar. I think a few of them can be. They're not be prepared, but they can be similar in that matchup in how much they can clear, and in different situations. Of course, they're better if there's like not an entire full board where you would need to be prepared. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that it increases your density of 7 cost clears, and it makes it less likely that you completely whiff once you get to 7 and you need to stabilize. So having a little bit more density in your 7 cost clears also helps in that matchup in comparison to set 1.
Mm-hmm. All right, there is a card in Amethyst. So, like I talked about, almost every single Ruby Amethyst deck is playing 4 evasive Minnie Mouse. 1/3 evasive, 3 cost can be inked. which is OP, by the way. But there's a card in Amethyst. It's a 4-cost uninkable called Peter Pan Shadow. It is definitely, this card is designed. I guarantee you when they designed this, they're like, this card hoses evasives. It's like, you have this card in your deck, you're very good against evasives. Because what it does is it also has evasive, it has rush, and it says your other characters with rush gain evasive. So things like your Mauis can now clear those 1/3s. Is this card playable in the Ruby Amethyst mirror, or is it just simply too inefficient because it costs 4? Your 4-cost slot is tight. It's tight because that's where your Merlins are, and it's uninkable. How do you feel about this card into Minnie Mouse?
It's like Moyen said. Moyen said before the podcast, he's like, it doesn't even clear the Minnie Mouse. If it cleared the Minnie Mouse, then we could talk, right? Then we could actually talk.
Yeah, that'd be
Oh,
nuts.
if it was a 3/2. Oh, yes.
So basically, the biggest issue with it is you can never rush down the prominent threat, which is the mini. But let's say, so for the card to be good, you would need it, the Pongo, in the game where you draw it, you would need Pongo to be a good card so that you actually want to play it. Because it's uninkable, right? You don't have, and Pongo isn't always a good card.
Mm-hmm.
The Pongo being inkable is very important. And that's I think, is the big issue of the card. Because if Pongo would be a card you could put down on turn 4, like the majority of games, I think the card would be a good tech card for the mirror, because it would mean that the following turn you can Maui into your opponent's evasive threat and then get a lead on the board and kind of get ahead. The only problem is, okay, it is not always a good card. It is uninkable. That is pretty bad. And even if you play it on turn 4, your opponent has a mini. The mini is still questing for another turn. Only then you can rush it down, and then it's not a whole lot of turns until it's be prepared territory anyways.
Yeah, I mean, it also does make it so your Madam Mim can rush these things down. I mean, it just gives you that stat advantage versus these opposing Minnie Mouses, because currently right now,
would you not just play Jetsam though? No, wasn't that the dude we were playing last time, the 3/3 evasive, isn't it?
So I mean, so the Jetsam, it was a 3/3 evasive. The Jetsam is interesting. So Jetsam also costs 4, I believe. The thing about
inkable as well, I think. Yeah.
The thing about Peter Pan Shadows, it just like it makes it so your Mauis and your Madam Mims that are on board are like legitimate threats against these Minnie Mouses. I don't know. I just remember
it's like how impactful is that though? You know, it's like, am I really throwing my Maui into a 1/3?
I would 100% throw my Maui into a 1/3 in the mirror. Maui is like it's terrible card in the mirror. Like you ink it, honestly, like it's maybe a downside that you're even playing Maui to the board because it should be used as ink in the mirror. Like that's how bad it is.
Yeah, most of the time, yes. So basically, now that you're talking about Rush Madam Mim, so because if you have Rush Madam Mim on the board, and then your opponent goes mini, and then you go Peter Pan, trade your Rush that's already on the board into.
Well, you can't do that. You can't do that.
Once
Right?
it's
exerted. Yeah.
So it's okay. Let's say they're on the play and they play mini mouse. Then you play Rush Mim, and then they exert it, and then I play it. So there's some merit in that. It's just, I think most of the time you don't really want to be playing Rush Madam Mim on turn 3 preemptively. A lot of the time you'd rather be playing Friends on the other side or Maleficent, so that's a little bit of an issue there.
Let me talk about so there's a dynamic that I think that Peter Pan Shadow helps solve that we're not quite talking about. So the reason why Minnie Mouse is so powerful in the mirror is because it taxes your opponent's removal. It asks your opponent to remove a 3-cost with some of their high priority cards, things like the Yzma, things like Be Prepared, what used to be Dragonfire. Like it is asking them to Lady Tremaine a 3-drop. And what Peter Pan Shadow does is it gives you more outs to kill the Minnie Mouse with other characters or other cards that are not as useful in the matchup, and then use your removal for actual threats. So use your removal against the Ursulas, against opposing Lady Tremaines, against opposing Maleficents. So it's just giving you that room to not have to use your high priority removal into a 3-cost 1/3 Minnie Mouse. I think that's really the idea behind it.
So basically, what this discussion is leading towards is, okay, I think I would conclude the card is pretty good in the matchup, right? I would, if I know I'm playing that matchup, I won't want it in my deck. But let's say I'm going in a tournament, what matchup spread would need to, like, how many Ruby Amethyst are you expecting that you would actually put this in your deck? For me, I think it would be 75-80% for me to actually want to put Peter Pan Shadow in my deck.
I wouldn't even put 4 in my deck then, I don't think. I think
Oh
I'd
yeah,
put, like,
I don't.
2.
Yeah, I don't think.
It's
I
just a
think you
few.
run 4.
Yeah.
It's like it's uninkable, and yeah, it's just too. It's too taxing. That being said, there's an interesting dynamic there too, because when you talk about metagame representation, you could be like, okay, let's say the metagame representation is very unhealthy, and say it's like 50% Ruby Amethyst. That's a lot, but you although it's 50% Ruby Amethyst representation that shows up to the tournament, based off recent results, you could reasonably expect the top 8 is going to be 80% Ruby Amethyst. Is that enough for you to put the card in? Like, if it's not like 80%, because 80% people showing up with a single deck is like, I've honestly never seen that happen, especially in an open tournament or even in a closed tournament. But you can reasonably predict that a top 8 would be that saturated with a single deck.
Yeah, so basically, if I'm confident enough that I'm making top cut, even if my deck's a little suboptimal against the entire matchup spread, and then I want to have a better chance to make it like top 4, top 2, or to win the event, I think it's a viable tech at 1 or 2 copies.
Yeah, I'm interested to experiment with it. We'll get into the main topic, which is just we're going to be talking about how we're going to approach this. We've talked about it a little bit already. How we're going to approach Ruby Amethyst. We're going to try to approach beating Ruby Amethyst with not another Ruby Amethyst deck, because that would honestly, that's probably our natural inclination. Anyway, I was gonna any other deck lists we potentially we talked about Amber Steel. I mean, there are other deck lists that show up in this top 32 and this top 8. They are, individual, so they're one-ofs at that. So I don't think they warrant too much discussion. All I can say is that the biggest conclusion I would draw from these results is that, Ruby Amethyst is very, very, very much on top right now. You do see occasionally, you see aggro decks sneak in, but it seems like they are still being gatekept by the Amber Steel decks, and the Ruby Amethyst deck in general is just stronger against aggro than it used to be. It has more low to the ground threats. The mono mims are very, very good for that, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and hop into our spilled ink section, which is our listener question section. If you want to get your question read out on next week's podcast, you can shoot us a comment on YouTube. First one comes from Michael Snap. They say, another great episode, gents. Getting lost in your own head during a tournament is rough. I played a match at a $500 cash event where I thought the board states were equal or slightly tilted towards my opponent. He misplayed and got so mad at himself that he scooped a game he likely could have won. It can be difficult when you make a mistake, but you have to try to move past it. Otherwise, you can blow your next game, next round, or rest of the tournament. I have also had an opponent scoop to me when they were 100% going to win the game before. They just did not know what I had in hand. Sometimes, this goes into the concept of playing to your outs. Like, you should always be playing to your outs. Often there is very little to be gained by conceding. Sometimes you're in an unwinnable position, but more often than not, you're actually not getting yourself any sort of advantage by conceding. And I have absolutely had opponents concede into me that were going to likely win that matchup. I've also had opponents miss lethal because I passed the turn back to them. They had onboard lethal. I passed the turn back to them. So they were like, they second guessed it. And then I'll tell you this story. I was at locals. My opponent literally has onboard lethal. I tank, look at my hand, say some things here, say some things there, just like chatting it up. I draw out my turn maybe for like 60 seconds. And I'm like, okay, we'll see if you, I literally say this, I go, we'll see if you have it. And this is someone I know and I've been playing against for a while. So I was definitely some banter. I was like, we'll see if you have it. So I pass it back over to him. And I'm telling you, he literally has lethal. He doesn't have to have anything. He just turns sideways. So he starts counting out loud. And I'm like, as soon as he counts out loud, I'm like, I'm screwed. There's no way. He's counting out loud. Like, oh, so, and he miscounts out loud. And then he proceeds to wheel. And he wheels me a whole new hand of cards. Ultimately, he still won the game. I was infinitely far behind, but I was just like, it was just a funny situation because, I could have conceded there, but my only out to that game was like, maybe he misses lethal. I actually didn't care about winning the game. I just wanted to see if it would work, and it totally did. But talking about Michael's point, I've definitely had opponents get tilted and concede games that they were absolutely going to win into me.
I do want to just point out one quick thing there, and it's something that you taught me pretty early on for Lorcana, Brendan. At the start, and this was in old Ruby Amethyst meta, like mirror matches and stuff like that, where often you'd only really get to have 2 games played. Sometimes it was one game that was drawn out for a long period of time. Somebody won that game, and then pretty much whoever won that first game was winning because your next game went to a draw. Great tip that Brendan taught me, and it is like I would say you have to play to your outs, but then there's also an extent where, okay, if you really, really, really know you're losing and you recognize that, okay, if the next game it means I go first and like, you know, I can kind of get going again. If it means that you think you can actually take the win and win your next 2 games, it's important to realize that and not get a draw. You know, in the situation that you really want the win or you're confident that you can still get the win. If you just had a bad hand and they had a god hand, you're like, okay, let's just go again. You sometimes need to recognize that. Like, it is important to not just play, like, okay, if you really feel like you're losing the game and it's going to be drawn out for like 15 minutes of, you know, you being out attrition and they just have, like in the old Ruby Amethyst decks where they just have
broom and shit, and you're like,
yeah.
It's like,
yeah, you should just go next game.
Yeah,
you know?
100%. I think that's a great concept. Luckily, it never happened to me because we were playing evasives and everybody else wasn't. So they just lost. They always lost game 1. But I mean, you have to look at it. You have to approach it from how do I win the best 2 out of 3. You're not just trying to win the individual game. You're trying to win the set. And often, if you are playing a control deck, like you will not have time to finish a 3-game set. So it can be correct to occasionally concede game 1 and move on to game 2 and try to play out to the game 3 because that's your only out to actually winning the game.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, next one is from Audis Turner. They say the worst experience I ever had was in 2005 Nationals of World of Warcraft TCG at Gen Con, 15 rounds on day 1. Yeah, that's a lot. This is in reference to last week's podcast, which is about how to prepare for tournaments. The worst one I had been to was Flesh and Blood, the Calling Auckland, the first constructed calling for Flesh and Blood. It was, I don't even remember how many rounds of Swiss, but also top 8 on that day. And top 8 was untimed, and players they actually changed the rules after this tournament. You used to be able to sort graveyards, and you could not after this tournament because it delayed the tournament by so long. Because Flesh and Blood is a very resource-intensive game, deck resource-intensive game. So people were sorting graveyards, figure out exactly what cards their opponents had, etc. And it went from, I mean, we probably showed up at around 8 or 9 a.m., and it went to 2 in the morning. It was a long one.
That is crazy, bro.
It was a long one.
Oh my god.
Morty, you had any bad or extended tournament experiences with One Piece?
Not really. I mean, I've had a few couple-hour delays at the start, so they finished later than they should have. But it's nothing I'm not used to.
Yeah.
What about Hearthstone or anything like that? Any crazy?
Not really. I mean, like we had entire tournament days, but like everything just according to schedule, basically.
Yeah, but you recognize that. Yeah.
I mean, we had a few metas where there was like, because rounds aren't timed in Hearthstone, where there was control matchups that would last like a couple hours for one round, but
yeah,
but that's basically it.
Sure.
All right, next one is from Rocket Blaze. They say, here is another important aspect of tournament play. During the Swiss rounds of the Saturday Lorcana 1K at SCG Con Pittsburgh, my wife watched a guy move cards between his inkwell and his hand. His opponent was new at card games and missed the cheating. It was unfortunate, but you have to stay on top of everything your opponent is doing. I also had an opponent who accelerated the pace of play to a point where he was shortcutting game actions. I asked him what he was doing. He apologized before talking through his plays. Everything was valid and legal. I think he just reverted to Pixelborn mindset and stopped communicating.
This is something I've seen on Twitter, and it's a point that is really interesting. I wish you kind of talked about it a little bit when we were talking about like how advantageous Pixelborn has been to the Lorcana community and stuff like that. When if the majority of a player's time is playing Lorcana within Pixelborn, and then they start to go to these major events, this is something that they really need to consider. A lot of the game actions when you're playing the digital version of Lorcana are automated. Like, you know, things like using your ink. These are things that I had to get used to as a first-time TCG player. And, you know, over time, I have gotten used to it. But at the start, it can be a struggle. You can forget to do it. You can be slow at doing it. Like, it just takes time. But it's something to definitely keep in mind. If you're excited for these official events coming in Q2 of 2024, you know, try and, you know, I'm not telling people go buy Lorcana if you can't buy Lorcana, but just keep these things in mind of that, you know, when you're sitting down and you have a deck in front of you, you will have to do these game actions that are automated on the digital client.
I think it's wildly different than Pixelborn for what it's worth. Like playing in paper is like, it's surprising. If you only play digitally, I did this in Flesh and Blood one time. I prepared digitally, showed up to the tournament with a paper deck, and I was very surprised at how jarring it was. Like it was very, very jarring. So I would recommend getting in paper experience if you can for a tournament. What were you going to say, Moyen?
Yeah, just like before the tournament, spend some time doing it, even if you know the game actions, right? It takes some time to get comfortable doing them, so that your entire mind can be focused on the actual decisions during the game, and not just on, oh, I have to turn this sideways, I have to put this at this spot. That's very important.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, in regards to cheating, of course, cheating is something that can happen in paper, which doesn't happen online. I do think that in general, so obviously I'm not referring to this example specifically, but in general, I think players are a little bit too quick to assume cheating over basic incompetence and ignorance in most scenarios in card games. Yeah, I think that you should give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. Not that you shouldn't call a judge on them and they shouldn't be punished for making a illegal play, like if they are doing something like picking up their inequality or something like that. But in terms of malicious intent, usually they're just bad. But it is something to keep in mind when you are playing at a paper card game tournament, because people absolutely can subvert the rules and gain advantages through ways that are not designed in the game. And that's why you have a judging staff, and that's why you have to pay attention. Like I've been cheated at locals in Lorcana many times, completely because my opponent was trying to play fast. We were trying to make it in time, and they just like screwed something up. It was absolutely not malicious intent, but Ruby, Amethyst, Mirror, both players have 19 ink. We're trying to activate Cauldron, draw multiple cards off of two different magic mirrors, and like all this stuff. You have to put a card on bottom, and it's like, did I put that on card? Did I draw yet? Did I do this? Did I tap this mana? It's like, yeah, they're trying to shortcut stuff, so it happens all the time, and it's just a part of the game. Obviously, when you're in a tournament, don't let that happen, and make sure that people are actually going through all of the game actions. All right, over to the last one here. Last one of them is from Tarbarik. They say, I'm curious to see the competitive state of the game if Pixelborn didn't exist. And he says, does one of you use Pixelborn? We actually all use Pixelborn. I think most of us.
I'm probably the person that uses it the least at the moment.
I think we've played the most on Pixelborn. I've actually played a lot in person, to be honest. Like there was a point where I was going to multiple locals a week. But yeah, I play a lot of Pixelborn, and I think it's critical to. I think Pixelborn is the reason why people are so as good at the game as they are right now, because it just really puts. You have so much data, so many people testing. It really puts it to the test when somebody has a theory. Because I've played paper card games that didn't have digital clients, and everybody had an idea of what was the best and what wasn't, and they had their ego was tied up into it. I feel like with Pixelborn, you come to a more objective result on like what's good and what's not good.
Yeah. So we already saw a lot of meta evolutions, and I think. Without Pixelborn, maybe they would have happened in like half a year, and we're already at that stage now. With like, for example, the how Ruby Amethyst is evolving and how the lists are changing, how other decks are adapting to it, how we had the blue-red deck. All of the stuff would have eventually happened, but it just would have taken a lot longer time.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of like how the blue-red deck blew up so fast is because we had Pixelborn and creators and people could kind of brew and use that. Like that was week one. There's no way some dude, if there was no Pixelborn, was like, okay guys, this is my deck. I already know it's absolutely disgusting. And he just has, I've played against, my partner or whatever for a few games and it's broken. I've broken the meta. Like that's not gonna happen,
Yeah, it's honestly. This is like a big concept that gets talked about in a lot of paper card games that have these digital clients, usually third-party digital clients, but like it definitely is kind of a downside, the sense that the meta does get solved way faster, or like the information is just way better than it would be if it was just paper, because it is more interesting, I think, to prepare for a tournament when the information is more imperfect. That being said, the benefit that Pixelborn brings to Lorcana, the community, and just the game as a whole outweighs that drastically. But I know, Flesh and Blood was a game that started out in paper and got its digital client, third-party digital client, a couple of years into it, and people were, there was a lot of talk of like, should this be happening? Because it drastically changes the way the game is played, how the meta evolves, adapts, and things get solved a lot faster, especially when you have access like we do with Pixelborn to like the back-end data, and it's published publicly. I mean, the person who knows more about this than anybody is probably Moyen, because he played Hearthstone, and that is like the ultimate data game.
We have some stat sites with like filtering out the data immediately, thousands of games, and like filtering for top ranks. But even with that, people are so bad at Hearthstone, and that's not a front. It's a very, very difficult game. I was probably wasn't great at it. so that it still takes time to get stuff figured out. And even after a month, there's often still new innovations coming up. So I like stuff getting figured out. I think even if you can get a smaller edge, I think the game is more fun when it's in a place. Okay, I might be in the minority here, but I think the game can be more fun if it's in a place where you know all the different dynamics that are going on instead of getting surprised by every card you see.
I do like, for me, the biggest part of it, and I think I've said this before, is that the number one thing that I think is conducive to a game's success is people playing that game, and Pixelborn facilitates that to the extreme, right? Like many more games of Lorcana are being played because Pixelborn exists than if it hadn't. And this podcast probably wouldn't exist if Pixelborn didn't exist, to be honest, because a lot of players here are able to access the game through that. Anyway, that concludes our Spilding section, our listener question section. Again, if you want to get yours read out for next week, shoot us a comment on YouTube. All right, we talked about it a lot in the headlines, so we're just going to hit on the main topic for a bit, which is how do we beat Ruby Amethyst? How do we break this metagame? I don't know. We're going to focus over the next 1 to 2 weeks, right? The next 1 to 2 weeks, we're going to get together with the three of us and work on a deck that can beat Ruby Amethyst. We're going to find some Gauntlet Ruby Amethyst deck. We'll post that for you guys. Maybe some other Gauntlet decks to represent the rest of the metagame. We'll make those public so that you can do it yourselves. And then we're going to do some internal testing. Let's just talk about definition of success. Must be favored into Ruby Amethyst. Must be favored. Maybe one undefeated locals into an open metagame. Winning at locals, nothing to flaunt about. But, take this new deck list to locals. And it needs to have hopefully, this is the stretch goal, a reasonable matchup spread. All right. But colors and archetypes we're looking at. I'm looking at Steel Amethyst, although I think that's going to be a tough one. Outside of that, it's really just, I remember Sapphire Emerald from set 1. I think it's in a much worse place because Ward is less impactful than it was in set 1. Set 1, Ward was impactful because everyone's playing 4 Maleficents. Most people are playing 2 to 4 Dragonfires, and it blanked all of that. Nevertheless, still could be good. Sapphire also got a really good card in the form of Caterpillar, which is 1/3 the quest for 3. So just basically an aggro Sapphire deck that utilizes Ward and maybe things like Eye of the Fates to try to go under the opponent. It's very honestly, any aggro deck could beat that out, but because Emerald Sapphire has things like Ward, has things like Cusco, potentially like the Flynn Riders, like maybe that could give you an edge. That being said, like that deck list is historically terrible into Amber Steel, and that's fine if that's what it takes. The other thing I'm looking at, kind of a meme, which I don't think will be good, or like a combo deck. Maybe Emerald Steel Mill. I honestly don't think it would actually be good into Ruby Amethyst ultimately, but maybe you could take it to a tournament and surprise some people that weren't aware of exactly what you were doing. You can mill them out. If you can mill them out with Amber Steel, you can definitely mill them out with Emerald Steel. Nevertheless, I don't have too much faith in that strategy. And then finally, like maybe something like a Sapphire Steel. I just feel like that color combination is missing a few key pieces at this point. And actually, that isn't the last. The last one is honestly, I would just revisit potentially the Sapphire Ruby and see if we could tweak that deck list in a way that it's actually good into Ruby Amethyst. What are you guys thinking?
I'm thinking all of these. I have doubts. Like, it's hard, man. It's so hard. Like, talking through each one of these color combinations, I'm just thinking of like weaknesses against Ruby Amethyst, which is tricky, right? Like any of the Sapphire stuff, like Sapphire Ruby, Sapphire Steel. If you're playing Sapphire, you're kind of focusing on ramp, and we can already see that Ruby Amethyst kind of outpaces any type of Sapphire stuff at the moment. I think if it was me, I think I'm kind of with you, Brennan. I want to try and see if I can do something with Steel, combo that with another color. I think Steel Amethyst might be a good place to start, especially since, like we said, like it was a small group of players, but to see a Steel Amethyst come out on top of a tournament where majority of top 8 was Ruby Amethyst is pretty impressive. So I feel like that's a good place to start, honestly. I think that's probably our best place to start, in my opinion.
So the way I see it, I think we can try aggro with moderate success, but it won't have a great matchup spread. And then the other 2 decks that maybe I would have still a little bit of hope in would be I think either Amethyst Steel. See if we test that deck a lot, if we optimize it for that matchup as well as we can. How good is it actually into Ruby Amethyst? And the other thing that I think we could give a try, which I think it's not necessarily the counter we're looking for, but maybe it can have a very close matchup and a good matchup spread would still be Ember Steel for Sleepy Flute. Bang bam.
There's a lot of people playing for Sleepy Flute, to be honest. Like,
so I checked the 160 player tournament we were covering in this podcast, and the top performing Ember Steel deck, which wasn't that high, I think it was the top 16 deck, but the top performing Ember Steel deck did play for Sleepy Flute. So the Sleepy Flute train is continuing.
Yeah. I mean, a card that I'm honestly, I think I'm more interested in the rest of the group in terms of Emerald Sapphire. But the problem is like, yeah, I mean, Emerald Sapphire is not as like, it doesn't cheat as hard as like Amber Amethyst in terms of like just in timing out like some like 1/9 or something like that. But it does have a lot of evasion, and I think Cusco is still a powerful card. It's tough with the Meta Mims. Like the Meta Mim package is very, very powerful. The reason why I like Steel Amethyst is I think that we can like double down on the control aspects of the deck. My issue is like them going under us, but we do have Steel to help them from going under us, right? We have things like Smash, and just like the AoE board removal. But I think that if we double down on some of the items in the deck, because we have Beast for card draw, of course, and also Amethyst is a card draw color, but the Benjas in terms of removing our opponent's Sorceress spellbooks, and then maybe we even play more items of our own to develop more engines on board. The issue that you have with Steel Amethyst fundamentally is that it does not have board wipes, right? So if you fall behind in board, it's definitely harder to come back. I just wonder if you could create a deck that is controlling enough, is removing your opponent's pesky, like uninteractable threats like items via Benja, and then develop your own sort of item engine and be able to outvalue your opponent that way. Or would it just be too slow because they have access to, you know, all these crazy cards? And it's ultimately the board wipe. You do lose really good cards when you get rid of Ruby, but main thing is like, how does Amethyst Steel come back from a board that it's behind on? And it's very inefficiently at best.
Yeah. So basically I think it's decent at fighting for board against Ruby Amethyst. It can remove their spellbox and develop its own, so it can have a win condition in that way. I think the biggest issue is, as you said, the board wipes, and specifically, I think with now Ursula being popular, I don't see that color combination dealing super well with opposing Ursulas. I think Ursula will just hit the board and quest for 3, and it will be very, very hard for
yes
Amethyst Steel to get that off the board.
Luckily, I mean, Ursula is not that popular quite. It's definitely rising in popularity. There's a 1 or a 2 here there. I think if people are playing for Ursula, it's pretty bad. it's pretty freaking bad because I mean, what is Steel gonna do against a 2/8?
All we have against the 2/8 is within the Amethyst package of the Yzma, but then we just then they get 3 cards. They play the Ursula, and then we give them 2 more cards as well.
But okay, Yzma still right. I kind of forgot about Yzma. Maybe it can still work then, because it's about the tempo, right? Even if they get a lot of cards, maybe if you have a few spellbooks they don't have
exactly.
Any, maybe the Yzma can still.
We have the spellbooks. It's all about tempo. It doesn't matter if they draw the extra cards because they can't deploy them. I don't know. It's interesting. We'll give it a try. But that's our goal over the next 1 to 2 weeks. We're going to do some internal testing, see if we can come up with a deck list that can beat Ruby Amethyst. Because right now, the metagame is absolutely dominated by Ruby Amethyst. Like, Ruby Amethyst is very much more the best deck of Chapter 2 than it was the best deck of Chapter 1. It's much more conclusive. So, we've got some work to do for there. Anyway. Just want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast throughout 2023 as we close into 2024. I think it'll be next year by the time we record this. So we appreciate it. We're excited for the ride of 2024 and what that means for organized play. We're a very organized play focused podcast, so it's going to be a big year for us. Again, if you want to get your question read out, you can shoot us a comment on YouTube. Any deck lists, anything like that is going to be in the description below, so you can check it out there. We're usually linking to Mushi Report. I use that website all the time. It's great for aggregating deck lists. If you listen to this podcast, number one thing you can do for us is leave us a review on pod platforms. That's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It means a ton. And there's a video version of this on YouTube. youtube.com/Podcana podcast. Hit the subscribe while you're there. On Twitter, Brendan APG, Moyen _HS, and Kawatech _CG. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.